chapter 3.6, the Renaissance. I'm showing a couple images from 3.2, the Middle Ages, just to show the transition into the Renaissance. The Middle Ages last 1,000 years, from the year 400 to the year 1400, roughly. And there is never like or not never, but there's not usually just a leap out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere. It progresses, if that makes sense. So there's usually a few precursors, a few godfathers, if you will, or unusual artists that make the shift. So we're going to look at a couple of examples really quickly here from chapter 3.2. This is a Gothic piece. This is the year 1280. So we're not in the Renaissance here. So Cimabue, the Virgin and child, enthroned in 1280. So we kind of see how no one's really sitting in space. It's all kind of floaty. The figures are flat. Her drapery is stylized. And there's just these perfect row of heads here. And we don't even know where these angels are. They could be floating, right? Then we get into, this is more of a Byzantine style, so we're reflecting even further back. So everything's elongated in the figure. They're kind of flat. They're not really anywhere in particular. Then Giotto is the student of Cimabue. I don't exactly know that pronunciation. That's one I did not look up. And does the same composition, roughly, but we're going toward the Renaissance. So Giotto and Duccio are two artists. We are not looking at Duccio yet. We will. That are the precursors to the Renaissance, but they're sort of the bridge between these two styles. So here he has a little bit more anchoring in the floor here. The drapery is more realistic. There's a light source that looks more realistic. There's like a shadow coming off. You can see the robes have a defined shadow on one side and it's lighter on the other side. The heads are sometimes blocking each other because the halos would naturally sort of block, or the heads would block another person behind them. So that overlapping is what we call that, and that is one of the early ways that depth is shown in a painting. And you can see how there's even overlapping here of the throne over this person's head. We're getting more into the Gothic architecture here, but the architecture is the throne itself in this piece is looking more realistic. Okay, so we're getting three-dimensional in the forms, believable space, and he's the forefront of stylistic change. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Renaissance proper, 1400 to 1600, and then the Baroque is 150 years, 1600 to 1750. They do influence each other. So the Renaissance is the rebirth. It's a renewed interest in the classical world. Remember, there are all those ruins from Roman times in Italy. This is kind of where we're starting. And stuff gets unearthed from time to time. 1,400 years have passed, and people are digging up or finding these sculptures and starting to admire them again. Humanism, the focus on human achievement and the manifestation in humans of God through their perfection. Does that make sense? So we're not focused so much on the fallibility of humans and the perfection of God's, but we're finding a way to find that within humans. More education's happening. Reformation, Counter-Reformation, that gets into the Baroque. We'll get into that later. So Catholic beliefs are underscored at times. Sometimes they're challenged. But the church is often a patron, okay? So there's also the intermediaries in art. Those are the saints. So we're emphasizing the influence. Try to say that together. Emphasizing the influence of the important, of the church, and the importance of intermediaries such as priests, the Pope, and saints. Okay, so we'll see that in the artwork. Frescoes, those we know what frescoes are. Big pieces, and they're sort of instructional to a degree. And then Giorgio Vasari writes Lives of the Great Artists. So that's a first art history book, and it starts to look at the past and bring that in. Okay, and then we'll get into the Northern Renaissance. I feel like it's a little bit more than we need to look at now. Look over this PowerPoint in the regular PowerPoint section. Here's our map of Europe. Now, Italy is not Italy. Italy doesn't really become called that until the 20th century. I know that sounds incredible because France is called France and England's called England much earlier. But at any rate, these are different papal states. These are different little principalities, meaning that each one has a sort of an emperor or ruler for each. Milan, Venice, Florence, Naples, and Rome. Rome, of course, is the seat of power and where the Pope is. Remember, a lot of things in the Christian history did actually occur in Rome. So, the saints were there. And things like that. So they have more of a claim to the Christian past than other parts of Europe. Spain is now turned over to the Catholic religion, so there's more areas where you're going to see cathedrals and you're going to see more influences of the Renaissance. Okay, Middle Ages, we were Islamic for the most part for a big chunk of that time. Then we get up into the northern area. So we're getting into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany is over here. France is kind of here. So we see some different styles in the Northern Renaissance, which we'll get into in a bit. The Northern Renaissance is a little bit delayed. Early Renaissance takes place in Italy. Renewed interest in the classical past. Remember, we're surrounded by architecture and sculpture. Not so much painting. Painting doesn't get preserved that well from that era. A few cases like Vesuvius and so on, but that doesn't get discovered during the Renaissance. So developed systems of perspective, and then we're balancing the real, meaning humans, and the ideal of divine characters from the Bible, okay? And also some of the Greco-Roman gods come in as well. So we're going to look back at Giotto. Okay, so we have our child enthroned, and this was our influencer. And then we move forward into Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Now, it's a little confusing looking at these two scenes. I feel like the lighting in here is a bit, I don't know, I kind of wish I could see this a little bit better. But what happened is, the reason we're including this is these were samples submitted as a competition for the doors of a church, right? And the idea was to show the sacrifice of Isaac. Now I'm looking at our book, and they're competing for the competition for the bronze panels of the north doors of the Florence Baptistry. Okay, so Brunelleschi loses this, and Ghiberti wins this, partly because of the simplification of the design, but also because in this case, Brunelleschi is showing Isaac as fearful, right? And the idea was that Ghiberti was more popular because they're both proud and strong and accepting their fate, and the idealization of the body here. But the rock, I think, is so interesting here, how it was used. They were both given the same elements to be used inside here, like an angel flying up, and a messenger from God, and a lamb, and the figures and so on. And then they're all put in here in different ways. So the good news of Brunelleschi losing this is that he now is free to work on the Florence Cathedral's dome. Okay, so this is a big challenge. I included some links, a separate thing, a page with the Medici, Godfathers of the Renaissance, and it explains this building of this dome and the challenges inherent in this. And it was very, very difficult. Nothing like this had been attempted. And you can kind of see how it's octagonal. So it's a strange kind of a dome. Previously, the Hagia Sophia is still extant. The Pantheon is extant, not far, is in Rome, not far away. So he could look at domes, but this is a design that he was trying to perfect, really struggled with it, and came up with a great solution. So he had there was a competition for this as well, and so Brunelleschi is our first Renaissance architect. So this is a diagram of the dome, and it's not a true rounded dome in the way that we think of the Pantheon, like I said, is octagonal, but it was a complex design, very dangerous in terms of construction. But he came up with a lot of ways to build it, and then the procedures of building it were what partly his invented, how to hoist the materials up. So he invented that equipment, but he also came up with how to resolve the structural challenge, which is very impressive. 16 years he spent on this thing. Okay, so we're going to look at Masaccio, early Renaissance, 1427 here. Our perspective, our atmospheric perspective, our fading in the background and more detail in the front, and our linear perspective, our one-point perspective, which is kind of coming off of here and pointing this way, they aren't perfected yet, okay? These are not hard and fast. We haven't used a lot of mathematical precision in this, but you see the beginnings of it. So we're in early days here, some perspective, some sense of overlapping a little bit here too, but you can see how these buildings are drawn pretty correctly, and how it gets smaller as it goes away, bigger in the front, and how these lines follow down in one direction. Okay, so we have 3 stories in one. St. Peter gets money to pay the tax man out of the river here in this fresco, and a bit faded and so on with the colors. And then Christ is telling him to do it, and then St. Peter is here paying our tax man. Okay, so we're getting into 3-dimensional space that's naturalistic. We have a little bit of linear perspective going on there and atmospheric perspective. So Brunelleschi, again, early Renaissance man, and early meaning he knows multiple disciplines and excels. The hierarchy here about artwork is painting, sculpture, and architecture. Not necessarily in that order, but generally speaking. And he excels at all 3. Now, of course, we see him lose to Ghiberti in the bronze casting. That doesn't mean he never does another sculpture, but he excels in architecture and he excels in painting. We have some chiaroscuro and consistent lighting here and a continuous narrative that we discussed. Let's go back and look at the chiaroscuro really quickly. So chiaroscuro is to do with shading, okay? So as things curve around a body, right, you get a little bit of a darker area where the light source is, and the shading. Boy, I'm struggling today. And the light source is lighter on this side. So you get a really good blending and sculptural detail with chiaroscuro. This comes into play, things get even more 3-dimensional, but this is a good area here in his calves. These legs look very 3-dimensional in these cases. So that's where he's coming from. We have a shadow here. You know, it's starting to get more 3D looking, and we talked about our continuous